I thought this was an interesting topic to touch on. The alleged synagogue shooter was a churchgoer who taught Christian theology, raising tough questions for evangelical pastors. Now, here you have a young man who studied a theology but was misled by a false theology, one that was teaching him that, from what I read here, he was under the belief that the Jews killed Jesus. You ever heard someone say the Jews or the Romans or Pilate killed Jesus, or they're responsible for the death of Jesus? And you have a lot of people who believe that. Now, although the Jews who participated in the arrest, the persecution, and the subsequent death of Christ will pay for their sins, uh, they were not ultimately in control or responsible. Romans 8:32, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? So we see that it is the Lord who ultimately gave up his son, and he did it for a purpose. The problem with a lot of people and a problem with a lot of faulty theology is that it doesn't sit Christ, it doesn't sit God as the ultimate sovereign ruler of it all. They kind of have God up there, and then they kind of have the world turning on its own, and God is kind of intervening here and there, but He's not totally sovereign in their eyes, and this is why they fall into these type of heresies or delusions. Um, when you also understand that God had to kill His Son, Romans 3:25, God put Him forward as a propitiation by his blood, just as Abraham lifted the knife over the chest of his son Isaac, but then spared his son because there was a ram in the thicket. So God the Father lifted his knife over the chest of his own son Jesus, but he did not spare him. This is important to understand, because the ram, Christ being the ram, he was a substitute. And so when we understand that God didn't spare his own son because it was the only way he could spare us and still be a just God, Christ had to die. Okay? And when people have an incorrect theology, um, when it comes to this issue, they get everything wrong. Okay? They start pointing fingers. They start blaming. Okay? When the truth is, if you are a believer, you better be glad God the Father sent his son to die, because that's the only way you can escape the wrath of God that's coming. God killing his son was the most gracious thing that's ever been done for mankind. Okay? And without that, without the blood being shed, without the propitiation, the changing hand, there is no hope for any of us. So although the Jews, the Romans, Pilate, all of them have their part, it was ultimately God who sent his son. And glory be to him for that. So I think the biggest issue here is people trying to understand the betrayal next to the sovereignty of God. And I think that's this young man's issue. And he believed that to the point where he was ready to go and give his life in a sinful way for a false theology, where he mowed down Jews with a machine gun. So bad theology is dangerous. It's dangerous because it can stray people. It can lead them to believe things that are contrary to what God's will is and what's good for themselves. God is a good God, and those that follow him accurately, and those that look at his word biblically and understand it correctly, it's good for you. But when you skew the line, when you take out and you add to it, it can become very dangerous, very dangerous. So thank you for listening.